My name is Emily Johnson. I'm 52 years old, and this is the story of how 4 simple words completely shattered my world. When my son Michael called me last Tuesday and said, "We got married yesterday," I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. 24 years of raising him, supporting him, being there for every single moment of his life, and I wasn't even invited to his wedding. I couldn't believe it. My own son, the person I sacrificed everything for, had excluded me from the most important day of his life. Have you ever felt completely betrayed by someone you loved more than yourself? If this resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because I know many of you have been through something similar, and we're going to get through this together. You might think this is just another story about family drama, but trust me, what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about unconditional love. I spent the next 3 days crying, not eating, wondering what I had done wrong to deserve this treatment. My friends kept telling me that maybe he just wanted something small and intimate, but deep down, I knew there was something much darker going on. The person I had devoted my entire adult life to had basically erased me from his most important moment. This wasn't just about missing a wedding. This was about discovering that the relationship I thought we had was nothing but an illusion. But here's where the story gets really twisted. When I confronted him about it, his response was even more shocking than the original betrayal. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you're being too dramatic. It's not that big of a deal." Can you imagine hearing those words from your own child? The same child who called me crying when his girlfriend broke up with him in college. The same child who needed me to co-sign for his apartment because his credit wasn't good enough. Suddenly, all those moments when I dropped everything to help him felt like they meant nothing at all. What really broke my heart wasn't just being excluded. It was realizing that I had raised someone who could be so cold and calculating. I started thinking about all the signs I had ignored over the years, all the times he had taken my generosity for granted. There were moments when he would only call when he needed something, but I always brushed it off, thinking that's just how young adults behave. I was so blind to what was happening right in front of me, so desperate to be the perfect mother that I forgot to teach him how to be a decent son. The worst part? I found out through his social media that his new wife Jessica had been planning this for months. She had posted pictures of her dress shopping, her bachelorette party, even the venue booking, and somehow I wasn't worth a single mention or invitation. That's when I realized this wasn't just thoughtlessness. This was a deliberate choice to exclude me. But you won't believe what I discovered about Jessica and her real intentions when I dug a little deeper into their relationship. Let me paint you a picture of who I used to be before that devastating phone call changed everything. I was the kind of mother who never missed a school play, a soccer game, or a parent-teacher conference. When Michael was growing up, I worked 2 jobs just to make sure he could go to summer camps and have the latest video games that all his friends had. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own relationships, even my own health to make sure he had everything he needed to succeed in life. If you've ever put your children's needs before your own, you'll understand the depth of love and commitment I'm talking about. And if you do, please subscribe and like this video, because I want to share this journey with people who truly understand what it means to love unconditionally. Every major decision I made for 24 years revolved around what would be best for Michael. When he wanted to go to an expensive private college, I took out loans that I'm still paying off today. When he graduated and couldn't find a job, I let him move back home rent-free for 2 years while he figured things out. When he finally got his life together and moved out, I was genuinely happy for him, proud that all my sacrifices had paid off. I thought we had the kind of close relationship that would last a lifetime, the kind where your adult child wants to share their biggest moments with you. I actually used to brag to my friends about how close Michael and I were, so you can imagine how I felt when I realized that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was completely wrong. The Michael I thought I raised would never exclude his mother from his wedding day. The Michael I thought I knew would understand that being there for his marriage wasn't just about me. It was about honoring the journey we had been on together since the day he was born. But the Michael who called me that Tuesday was a stranger, someone who could casually drop a bomb like that and expect me to just accept it with a smile. It felt like meeting someone wearing my son's face but having the heart of a complete stranger. I spent that entire night replaying every conversation we'd had over the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. Had I been too pushy about wanting to meet Jessica? Had I said something wrong during our last dinner together? I drove myself crazy trying to figure out what I had done to deserve being treated like I didn't matter. The emotional whiplash was incredible. One day I'm a proud mother excited about my son's future. The next day I'm a woman who apparently isn't even worthy of knowing about her son's wedding until after it happens. The ground beneath my feet had completely disappeared. But as painful as that realization was, it was nothing compared to what I discovered when I started really paying attention to the patterns in Michael's behavior over the past year. See, there were warning signs that I had been ignoring, red flags that I had dismissed because I didn't want to believe my own son was capable of such manipulation. Jessica hadn't just appeared in his life randomly. She had been systematically working to push me out of it from the very beginning. And when you hear what she said about me behind my back, you'll understand why this story is about so much more than just a missed wedding. The phone call started so normally that I almost didn't pick up. Michael usually texted me instead of calling during his work hours, but something in my mother's intuition told me to answer, and I'm glad I did. Even though what I heard next would haunt me for weeks. He sounded excited, almost giddy, which immediately put me on alert because Michael wasn't usually the type to get emotional about anything. "Mom, I have some news," he said, and my heart started racing with anticipation. I was thinking maybe he got a promotion, or maybe Jessica was pregnant, or maybe they had finally decided to move back closer to home. Never in a million years was I prepared for what came out of his mouth next. "We got married yesterday." Those 4 words hit me like a freight train, and for a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. I actually asked him to repeat what he said because my brain couldn't process the information. When he said it again, slower this time, I felt this strange mix of emotions: confusion, hurt, disbelief, and underneath it all, a growing rage that I didn't want to acknowledge. My first thought wasn't congratulations or excitement. It was, how could you do this to me? I had been dreaming about his wedding day since he was a little boy, imagining myself helping him plan it, being there to see him promise his life to someone. Instead, I was finding out about it over the phone like some distant relative. The silence that followed must have lasted at least 30 seconds, because Michael actually asked if I was still there. I was still there, but I wasn't the same person who had answered the phone a few minutes earlier. I was trying to find words that wouldn't come out as screaming or crying, trying to sound like a supportive mother when all I wanted to do was hang up and pretend this conversation never happened. "Congratulations," I finally managed to say, but even I could hear how hollow and fake it sounded. Michael seemed oblivious to my tone, launching into this cheerful explanation about how they had decided to elope because wedding planning was too stressful and expensive. What made it even worse was how casual he sounded about the whole thing, like he was telling me about a movie he had watched or a restaurant he had tried. There was no acknowledgement of what this meant to me, no apology for not including me, no recognition that maybe his mother might want to be part of one of the most important days of his life. He talked about the ceremony like it was a business transaction. Quick, efficient, no fuss, no drama. But what he didn't understand was that by excluding me, he had created more drama than any traditional wedding ever could. He had turned what should have been a celebration into a source of pain that would change our relationship forever. As he continued talking about how perfect and stress-free everything had been, I realized that this wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of passion. This was planned, calculated, and deliberate. Jessica had been posting about wedding planning for months, so I knew they had been thinking about this for a long time, which meant that at some point, they had made a conscious decision that I didn't deserve to be there. They had looked at all the people who mattered enough to include, and somehow, the woman who gave birth to him and raised him didn't make the cut. But what I discovered about the guest list was even more shocking than being excluded. Let me tell you about the sacrifices I made for Michael, because I think it's important for you to understand just how deep this betrayal really goes. When Michael was 7 years old, his father walked out on us, leaving me with a mortgage, car payments, and a child to raise alone. I could have given up, could have moved back in with my parents and taken the easy way out, but I was determined to give Michael the stable, loving home that every child deserves. Have you ever had to choose between your own happiness and your child's future? If you've been in that position, or if you're a parent who's made those tough sacrifices, please hit subscribe and like this video. I want to connect with people who understand what real parental love looks like, because we're going to need each other for what comes next in this story. I worked as a nurse during the day and cleaned office buildings at night, just to make ends meet and save for Michael's college fund. There were weeks when I lived on peanut butter sandwiches, so Michael could have proper meals. Times when I wore the same 3 outfits to work for months, so he could have new school clothes. When other single mothers were dating and trying to rebuild their lives, I was at home helping Michael with homework, or driving him to baseball practice. I told myself that all of this sacrifice would be worth it when I saw him grow up to be a good man, someone who understood the value of family and loyalty. Every dollar I spent on him, every hour I devoted to his needs, I saw as an investment in our lifelong relationship. The financial support didn't stop when he turned 18 either. When Michael wanted to study engineering at a private university that cost $40,000 a year, I didn't hesitate to co-sign those student loans. When he needed a car to get to his internship, I emptied my savings account to help him with the down payment. When he graduated and struggled to find work during the recession, I paid his rent for 8 months while he got back on his feet. I calculated it once. Between his education, living expenses, and all the times I helped him out of financial trouble, I had invested over $200,000 in Michael's future. But the money was never the real investment. It was the love and time and energy I poured into raising him. Looking back now, I can see how my generosity might have actually enabled his selfish behavior instead of teaching him gratitude. I never asked for anything in return, never made him feel guilty about how much I was giving up for him. I thought I was being a good mother, showing him unconditional love and support. But maybe what I was really doing was teaching him that my needs didn't matter, that I would always be there to give him whatever he wanted without expecting anything back. Maybe I created a monster who learned to see me as a resource to be used rather than a person to be valued. The irony is that in trying to be the perfect mother, I might have failed to teach him how to be a decent human being. But here's what really gets me. Jessica knew about all of this. She knew how much I had sacrificed for Michael, knew about the loans I was still paying off, knew about the years I spent putting his needs before my own. She had sat at my dinner table, eaten meals I cooked, listened to stories about Michael's childhood, and smiled while I showed her photo albums of all our memories together. She knew exactly what kind of mother I had been to him, which makes what she did next even more calculated and cruel. Because it turns out that excluding me from the wedding wasn't just Michael's idea. It was part of a bigger plan that Jessica had been working on for months. About 3 weeks after that devastating phone call, Michael finally agreed to meet me for coffee to talk things through. I was hoping for an apology, maybe some explanation that would help me understand how we had gotten to this point. Instead, what I got was a conversation that made me question everything I thought I knew about the word special and what it means in a family relationship. Michael sat across from me, stirring his coffee with this distant look in his eyes, and said something that still echoes in my head today. "Mom, you've always been special to me, but Jessica needed her day to be about just us." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, like he was explaining why he chose one brand of cereal over another, made my blood run cold. Special. That word kept bouncing around in my head for days after our conversation. If I was so special to him, why wasn't I special enough to be included in the most important day of his life? If I was so special, why did Jessica's comfort matter more than my feelings? I started thinking about all the times over the years when Michael had used that word to describe our relationship, and I realized it had become a way to placate me without actually giving me what I needed. It was like giving someone a participation trophy while the real winners got the actual prize. "You're special, Mom," had become his way of saying, "You matter enough to keep around, but not enough to prioritize." The more I thought about it, the more I realized that special had become a manipulation tool in Michael's vocabulary. When I questioned why he never visited anymore, "Mom, you're special to me, but I'm just so busy with work." When I asked why he didn't call as often, "You know you're special to me, Mom, but Jessica needs a lot of attention right now." When I wondered why I was always the last to know about important things in his life. "Don't be silly, Mom. You're special. I just didn't want to bother you with the details." Every time he used that word, it was followed by an excuse for why my feelings didn't actually matter in the moment when it counted. But here's what really opened my eyes. I started paying attention to how Michael talked about other people in his life. His boss was important because he controlled Michael's career advancement. His college friends were valuable because they had connections that could help him professionally. His new in-laws were influential because they had money and social status. But me? I was just special. A nice, safe word that acknowledged my existence without giving me any real power or priority in his life. I realized that being special to Michael meant being kept at arm's length, valued enough to maintain the relationship, but not respected enough to be truly included in his life decisions. The cruelest part was that I had been so grateful to be called special that I never stopped to ask what that actually meant in practical terms. I was so starved for his approval and affection that I accepted scraps of attention and called it love. But real love isn't about being told you're special. It's about being treated like you're special. Real love is about actions, not words, about being included, rather than being managed. And when I finally understood the difference between being called special and being treated as special, I realized that Michael had been emotionally manipulating me for years. But that realization was nothing compared to what I discovered about Jessica's role in redefining my place in Michael's life. The exclusion from Michael's wedding wasn't just about missing one day. It was about being erased from a fundamental part of his life story. Every time someone asks him about his wedding day in the future, every time they look at wedding photos, every time they celebrate their anniversary, I will be completely absent from those memories. I wasn't just excluded from a party. I was excluded from becoming part of their family history. The pain of that realization hit me in waves. Sometimes when I was just doing normal things like grocery shopping or watching TV, I would suddenly remember that my son got married and I wasn't there, and the grief would wash over me all over again, like I was hearing the news for the first time. What made the exclusion even more painful was discovering who was actually included in their intimate ceremony. Through social media detective work that I'm not proud of, I found out that Jessica's entire immediate family was there. Her parents, her 2 sisters, even her grandmother, who had to be wheeled in from the nursing home. Michael's college roommate was there, along with 3 of his co-workers and 2 of Jessica's friends from high school. So this wasn't really about keeping things small and simple. This was about specifically keeping me out while including everyone who mattered to Jessica. I counted at least 15 people in the background of their wedding photos, which meant I was the only significant person in Michael's life who wasn't invited. The social aspect of being excluded added another layer of humiliation that I hadn't anticipated. Friends and neighbors started asking me about the wedding plans, wanting to know what I was wearing, whether I needed help with anything, if I was excited about gaining a daughter-in-law. Having to explain over and over again that I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding was like reliving the rejection every single time. Some people tried to be kind and suggested that maybe it was just a miscommunication, or that maybe I would be included in a reception later. Others gave me those pitying looks that made me feel like a charity case. The worst were the people who immediately started speculating about what I must have done wrong to deserve such treatment. But the deepest pain came from realizing that this exclusion was just the visible tip of an iceberg that had been forming for years. Looking back, I could see a pattern of gradual exclusion that I had been too blind or too hopeful to recognize. Holiday invitations that came later and later each year until I had to ask if I was still welcome. Family decisions that were made without consulting me, even when they affected me directly. Important news that I heard through other people instead of from Michael himself. The wedding exclusion wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a slow, systematic process of pushing me out of his life while making me feel grateful for whatever scraps of attention I received. The worst part about being excluded wasn't just the hurt feelings. It was the way it made me question every memory I had of our relationship. Were all those moments when I thought we were close actually just one-sided? Was I deluding myself about the bond we shared? Had I been so desperate to maintain our relationship that I had ignored signs that Michael was already emotionally gone? The exclusion forced me to confront the possibility that the son I thought I knew, the relationship I thought we had, might have been largely a figment of my imagination. And just when I thought the pain couldn't get any worse, I discovered the conversations Jessica had been having about me behind my back that would explain everything. Sitting alone in my living room that night, surrounded by photo albums and scrapbooks documenting 24 years of Michael's life, I forced myself to confront a painful truth about expectations and reality. I had spent so many years building up this fantasy of what our relationship would look like when he became an adult. The close mother-son bond, the family gatherings, the shared milestones and celebrations. I imagined myself as the mother of the groom, helping plan his wedding, maybe even walking him down the aisle since his father wasn't in the picture. Have you ever had your expectations completely shattered by someone you trusted? If you've experienced that kind of disappointment, please subscribe and hit the like button, because I want you to know that you're not alone in feeling this way, and there's hope on the other side of this pain. As I flipped through pictures of Michael's childhood, his first day of school, Little League games, high school graduation, I started to see the signs I had missed along the way. There were moments captured in those photos where I was clearly more invested in the experience than he was. Me beaming with pride at his science fair project, while he looked bored and distracted. Me cheering enthusiastically at his baseball games while he barely acknowledged my presence in the stands. Me hugging him tightly at graduation while he stood stiffly, already looking toward his friends instead of sharing the moment with me. The evidence had been there all along, but I had been so focused on creating perfect memories that I missed the fact that they were only perfect for me. I realized that I had been living in a fantasy relationship with my son for years, projecting my own needs and desires onto interactions that were probably much more superficial than I wanted to believe. When Michael called me once a week during college, I interpreted it as him missing me and wanting to stay connected. But looking back honestly, those calls were probably just him checking a box, fulfilling his obligation as a good son, without any real emotional investment. When he brought Jessica to meet me, I thought it meant he valued my opinion and wanted my blessing. But in reality, he was probably just going through the motions, following social expectations without caring about my actual feelings or thoughts about his choice. The most painful realization was understanding how my own desperation for connection had blinded me to Michael's true feelings about our relationship. I had been so afraid of losing him that I accepted whatever level of involvement he was willing to give me, never pushing for more, never demanding the respect and consideration I deserved. I convinced myself that his minimal effort was enough, because the alternative, admitting that he didn't really care about me the way I cared about him, was too devastating to accept. I had lowered my standards so far that basic human decency started to feel like extraordinary love and attention. But here's what really broke my heart as I sat there surrounded by all those memories. I realized that I had taught Michael that my needs didn't matter by never expressing them, never setting boundaries, never demanding better treatment. I had been so focused on being the cool mom, the understanding mom, the mom who never caused problems or made demands, that I had essentially trained him to treat me as an afterthought. My unconditional love had become unconditional acceptance of poor treatment. And as I closed those photo albums and faced the reality of who we really were to each other, I knew something had to change dramatically if I was going to survive this betrayal with my dignity intact. The weeks following my devastating realization about our relationship were like being trapped in an emotional maze with no clear exit. Every day I woke up hoping that somehow the situation would resolve itself, that Michael would call with a heartfelt apology, that this whole nightmare would turn out to be some kind of misunderstanding that we could laugh about later. But instead of getting better, my mental state kept getting worse as I fell into patterns of self-blame and destructive thinking that nearly drove me to a complete breakdown. I found myself replaying every conversation we'd had over the past year, dissecting every word, looking for clues about where I had gone wrong and what I could have done differently to prevent this outcome. The worst part was how I started attacking myself from every possible angle, creating elaborate theories about why I deserved this treatment. Maybe I had been too clingy when Michael was growing up, too involved in his life, too demanding of his time and attention. Maybe I had spoiled him with too much financial support and created a sense of entitlement that made him think he could treat me however he wanted. Maybe I hadn't been supportive enough of his relationship with Jessica, hadn't made her feel welcome enough, hadn't been the mother-in-law she needed me to be. Every possible explanation I came up with somehow ended with me being the villain in the story, the person who had caused this whole situation through my own failures and mistakes. I became obsessed with the idea that if I could just figure out the exact thing I had done wrong, I could fix it and restore our relationship to what I thought it used to be. I spent hours writing and rewriting text messages to Michael, trying to find the perfect combination of words that would make him understand how much he had hurt me without sounding too demanding or emotional. I drafted long emails explaining my feelings and then deleted them before sending, convinced that anything I said would only make things worse. I even considered showing up at his apartment unannounced to have a face-to-face conversation, but then talked myself out of it for fear of being seen as crazy or desperate. The self-sabotage extended beyond just my relationship with Michael and started affecting every area of my life. I stopped socializing with friends because I was embarrassed about what had happened and tired of having to explain the situation over and over again. I threw myself into work with an unhealthy intensity, taking on extra shifts and overtime hours to avoid being alone with my thoughts. I started eating poorly and sleeping even worse, caught in a cycle where my physical health declined along with my emotional well-being. I was essentially punishing myself for Michael's choices, as if by making myself suffer enough, I could somehow earn back his love and respect. But the most destructive thought pattern was my constant bargaining with the universe, making deals with God or fate or whoever might be listening about what I would give up to have my son back in my life. I promised to be less needy, less emotional, less involved in his decisions if he would just include me in future family events. I offered to pay for their honeymoon, to help them buy a house, to do whatever it took to prove that I deserved a place in their lives. I was essentially auctioning off pieces of my own dignity and self-worth, convinced that if I could just find the right price, I could buy my way back into Michael's affections. It took me weeks to realize that this kind of thinking was not only destroying me mentally, but it was also exactly the opposite of what I needed to do to actually heal from this betrayal. After weeks of torturing myself with questions and self-blame, I finally reached my breaking point on a Thursday evening when Michael texted me asking if I could co-sign a loan for a new car. The casual way he asked, as if nothing had happened between us, as if he hadn't completely devastated me just a month earlier, made something inside me snap. This wasn't a son reaching out to reconnect with his mother. This was someone who saw me purely as a financial resource to be used when convenient. I stared at that text message for about 20 minutes, feeling this white-hot rage building up inside me that I had never experienced before in my entire life. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay between us. I called him immediately, and when he answered with his usual cheerful, "Hey, Mom, did you get my text?" I felt like I was talking to a complete stranger. "Michael," I said, my voice shaking with anger, "are you seriously asking me for money right now? After excluding me from your wedding and treating me like I don't exist in your life?" There was this long pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear him trying to figure out how to manage me, how to smooth things over so he could get what he wanted. When he finally spoke, his tone had that patient, condescending quality that parents use with difficult children. "Mom, I thought we already talked about this. The wedding thing wasn't personal." "Not personal?" I practically screamed into the phone, and I didn't care who heard me. "Michael, I gave you everything I had for 24 years, and you couldn't even tell me you were getting married until after it happened. And now you want me to co-sign a loan like nothing happened?" That's when he said something that revealed exactly who he had become as a person. "Look, Mom, I need this car for work, and Jessica thinks it would be good for our credit if we had a co-signer. Can we please not make this about your feelings?" The word "please" came out like he was doing me a favor by even having this conversation, like my emotions were just an inconvenience he had to work around to get what he needed. But it was what came next that finally opened my eyes to the truth about our relationship. When I told him that I wouldn't co-sign anything until we had a serious conversation about how he had been treating me, he sighed like I was being unreasonable and said, "Fine, Mom. Jessica said you might react this way. She said older women sometimes get overly emotional about weddings and make everything about themselves." The fact that they had discussed my potential reaction, that they had planned for my hurt feelings like they were planning for bad weather, showed me that this exclusion had been completely calculated. They knew exactly how much it would hurt me, and they did it anyway. That conversation lasted another 10 minutes, but I barely remember the details because I was in shock over what I had just learned. My son and his wife had sat down together and strategized about how to handle my emotional response to being excluded from their wedding. I wasn't a person to them. I was a problem to be managed, a source of drama to be contained. When I finally hung up the phone, I felt something I had never felt before in my relationship with Michael, complete and total clarity about who he really was and what I actually meant to him. And that clarity, as painful as it was, would turn out to be the first step towards saving myself from a lifetime of this kind of treatment. The morning after that devastating phone call with Michael, I woke up feeling different in a way that I couldn't immediately identify. Instead of the usual anxiety and sadness that had been my constant companions for weeks, there was this strange sense of calm, almost like the eye of a hurricane. I realized that for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't wondering what Michael was thinking or planning my next move to try to repair our relationship. The emotional exhaustion of constantly trying to figure out how to fix things had lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like relief. Have you ever reached that moment where you finally stop fighting against reality and just accept what is? If you've experienced that kind of emotional surrender, please subscribe and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share might change how you think about difficult relationships in your own life. I spent that entire day doing something I hadn't done in months, focusing on myself and my own needs without thinking about Michael at all. I took a long bath, read a book I had been meaning to start, called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, and cooked myself a nice dinner, just because I wanted to. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary for someone who had spent decades making every decision based on how it would affect someone else. For the first time, I experienced what it felt like to live in my own life, instead of existing in the margins of Michael's life. The absence of constant worry and strategizing about our relationship created space for me to remember who I was as a person, not just as a mother. Over the next few days, I started experimenting with the concept of emotional minimalism. giving less of my energy to people who weren't giving energy back to me. Instead of checking Michael's social media obsessively, I deleted the apps from my phone entirely. Instead of driving myself crazy, wondering what he and Jessica were doing, I started planning activities for myself that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or preferences. Instead of rehearsing conversations I might have with him in the future, I started having real conversations with friends who actually valued my company. The less emotional energy I spent on Michael, the more I had available for myself and for relationships that were actually reciprocal. What surprised me most was how much mental space opened up when I stopped trying to solve the Michael problem. I had been carrying around this constant background stress, this mental program running in the back of my mind at all times, trying to figure out how to fix our relationship. When I finally shut down that program, it was like my brain had been freed up to think about other things, my career, my hobbies, my own future plans that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. I started to remember dreams and goals I had set aside years ago, interests I had abandoned because they didn't fit into my identity as Michael's mom. For the first time in decades, I was rediscovering Emily Johnson the individual, not just Emily Johnson the mother. But the most powerful realization came when I understood that my desperate attempts to maintain our relationship had actually been making it worse. By accepting whatever scraps of attention Michael was willing to give me, by never setting boundaries or demanding basic respect, I had trained him to treat me poorly. My unconditional availability had taught him that my time and energy had no value. My willingness to accept breadcrumbs had convinced him that breadcrumbs were all I deserved. The more I had given, the less he had valued what he received. And now, by pulling back and giving less, I was finally creating the possibility for him to realize what he had lost, though I was no longer sure I even wanted him to realize it. 3 weeks into my emotional detox from Michael, something incredible happened that I never could have predicted. I was at the grocery store minding my own business when I ran into Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman from my neighborhood, whose son had moved across the country for work 5 years earlier. She looked at me with this knowing expression and said, "Emily, you look different. You look lighter somehow." When I told her about what had happened with Michael's wedding, expecting the usual pitying response, she surprised me by smiling and saying, "Good for you for finally seeing the truth. Some children need to learn that their parents are people too, not just resources." That conversation was like a light switch being flipped on in a room I didn't even realize had been dark. Mrs. Patterson shared her own story of how her son used to treat her like a built-in support system, rather than a person with her own needs and feelings. She told me about the day she decided to stop being available whenever he called with problems, stop sending money every time he had a financial crisis, stop dropping everything to accommodate his rare visits home. The first 6 months were hard, she admitted, because I felt guilty for setting boundaries. But then something beautiful happened. He started treating me with respect, because he realized I wasn't going to accept anything less. Her words hit me like lightning, because I realized that I had never even considered the possibility that I could demand better treatment from my own son. That night, I started what I called my reconstruction project, deliberately rebuilding my identity and my life around my own values and needs, instead of Michael's demands and expectations. I made a list of all the things I had given up or put on hold over the years, because they didn't fit into my role as Michael's mother. Photography had been my passion in high school, but I had abandoned it because camera equipment was expensive and Michael needed college funds. I had always wanted to travel, but I saved that money instead in case Michael needed emergency help. I had been interested in going back to school for my master's degree, but I didn't want to be too busy to be available when he needed me. For the first time in decades, I started making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or approval. I enrolled in a photography class at the community college and bought myself a decent camera with money from my savings account, money that I would have previously reserved for Michael's emergencies. I booked a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in the mountains, something I had always wanted to do but never felt I could justify spending the money on myself. I started saying yes to invitations from friends, even when it meant I wouldn't be available if Michael decided to call. Each small act of self-care felt like rebellion against 24 years of self-sacrifice. The most surprising part of this reconstruction process was discovering that I actually liked who I was when I wasn't constantly focused on being the perfect mother. I was funny and interesting and capable in ways that had nothing to do with raising children or managing family relationships. I had opinions about politics and books and movies that were entirely my own, not filtered through concern about how they might affect Michael's life. I started to remember what it felt like to have conversations where I talked about my own experiences and thoughts, instead of constantly asking about the other person's life. I was becoming a whole person again instead of just a supporting character in someone else's story. And as I grew stronger and more independent, I started to realize that the relationship I had mourned losing with Michael had never actually existed in the first place. The day I decided to completely restructure my relationship with Michael, and with everyone else in my life who had been taking advantage of my generosity, was the day I realized that being a good person doesn't mean being a doormat. I was sitting in my photography class, learning about composition and lighting, when the instructor made a comment about how the most powerful photographs often have clear boundaries between light and shadow. "Without boundaries," she said, "you just get a washed-out image where nothing stands out." That simple statement about photography hit me like a thunderbolt, because I realized it applied perfectly to my life. Without boundaries, I had become a washed-out version of myself, where nothing about my own needs or desires stood out clearly. That evening, I sat down with a notebook and made 2 lists that would change everything. The first list was titled, "People Who Give Back," friends and family members who had shown up for me over the years, who called just to check on me, who remembered my birthday, who offered support during difficult times without expecting anything in return. This list was shorter than I expected, but the people on it were genuine treasures in my life. The second list was titled, "People Who Only Take," individuals who only contacted me when they needed something, who were always too busy when I needed support, who took my generosity for granted and never reciprocated. Unfortunately, Michael's name was at the top of this second list, along with several other people I had been pouring energy into for years without getting anything meaningful back. The next step was creating what I called my energy budget, a system for deciding how much time, emotional investment, and resources I would allocate to different relationships based on what I received in return. Just like a financial budget, this energy budget forced me to be strategic about where I invested myself, instead of just giving endlessly to whoever asked. People on my Gives Back list got unlimited access to my time and support because those relationships were reciprocal and nourishing. People on my Only Takes list got strictly limited access. They could have surface-level pleasantries and basic courtesy, but I would no longer sacrifice my own well-being to meet their demands. Implementing these boundaries required me to fundamentally change how I responded to requests for help, money, or emotional support. When Michael finally called me 2 weeks later, not to apologize or check on my well-being, but to ask if I could help him and Jessica with a down payment for a house, I used my new system. "I'm not in a position to help with that right now," I said calmly, without offering explanations or apologies for my decision. When he pushed back, clearly expecting me to cave in like I always had before, I simply repeated the same phrase. The old Emily would have felt guilty and found a way to help anyway. The new Emily recognized manipulation and refused to participate in it. The most liberating part of establishing these boundaries was realizing that I didn't need anyone's permission or understanding to protect my own well-being. I didn't need to justify my decisions to people who had never bothered to consider my feelings when making their own choices. I didn't need to explain why I was no longer willing to accept treatment that made me feel used and undervalued. Some people, including Michael, reacted to my boundaries with anger and accusations that I was being selfish or difficult. But I had learned that people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always be upset when you start protecting yourself. Their discomfort with my new standards was actually proof that the boundaries were necessary and working exactly as intended. 6 months after I started my journey of setting boundaries and reclaiming my life, I had what I can only describe as a spiritual awakening about the true nature of rejection and personal growth. I was hiking alone on a trail I had discovered near my house, something I never would have done before because I was always too worried about being available for Michael's emergencies, when I realized that his rejection of me had actually been the greatest gift he could have given me. It forced me to confront truths about myself and my relationships that I had been avoiding for decades. Have you ever experienced a painful situation that ultimately led to positive changes in your life? If you found strength through adversity, please subscribe and hit that like button, because I want to connect with people who understand that sometimes our biggest challenges become our greatest opportunities for growth. The rejection from Michael's wedding had acted like a mirror, showing me exactly how I had been living my life for the past 24 years. I had been so focused on being needed by others that I had never learned to need myself, so invested in other people's happiness that I had forgotten what made me happy, so committed to being the perfect mother that I had lost touch with who I was as an individual woman. The pain of being excluded forced me to ask questions I had never asked before. What did I want from life that had nothing to do with my role as a mother? What dreams had I abandoned in service of other people's goals? What would I do with my time and energy if I wasn't constantly managing other people's emotions and needs? During those quiet moments of reflection, often while I was developing photos in my new darkroom or reading books that challenged my thinking, I started to understand that rejection is often just redirection in disguise. Michael's rejection had redirected me away from a relationship that was draining my energy and giving nothing meaningful back, toward a life where I was the main character instead of a supporting player. His dismissal of my feelings had redirected me away from people-pleasing and toward self-respect. His exclusion from important moments had redirected me toward creating my own important moments that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. I began to see patterns in my life where rejection had actually been protection, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. The job I didn't get 5 years ago had led me to a position where I met my closest friend, Sarah. The man I dated briefly who broke up with me had actually saved me from wasting more time with someone who wasn't capable of real partnership. Even smaller rejections, social invitations that weren't extended, opportunities that went to someone else, had often cleared the path for better alternatives that I wouldn't have been available for otherwise. I started to wonder if the universe had been trying to guide me toward a better life all along, but I had been too attached to forcing specific outcomes to notice the gifts hidden in the disappointments. The most profound realization was understanding that my worth as a person had never been dependent on Michael's approval or anyone else's validation. I had been living like a beggar, grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection people were willing to throw my way, instead of recognizing that I had value simply by existing. The woman who had raised a child through poverty and sacrifice, who had built a career in nursing helping people during their most vulnerable moments, who had maintained friendships and contributed to her community for decades, that woman had always been worthy of love and respect, regardless of whether her son chose to acknowledge it. The rejection that had felt like a death sentence for my self-worth had actually been an invitation to discover my inherent value that existed completely independent of any external validation. 1 year after that devastating phone call that changed everything, I can honestly say that I am living the most authentic and fulfilling life I have ever experienced. The woman who used to panic if Michael didn't return her calls within a few hours now goes days without thinking about him at all. Not because I don't care, but because I'm too busy living my own rich and meaningful life to obsess over someone who has chosen not to be part of it. I've traveled to 3 different states with my photography, taking pictures of landscapes and people that capture stories of resilience and beauty. I've made new friends through my classes and volunteer work, people who value my company for who I am, not for what I can do for them. I've even started dating again, something I never thought I would have the courage or energy to do after decades of focusing solely on being Michael's mother. The financial freedom that came from no longer being Michael's personal ATM allowed me to make investments in my own future that I never could have imagined before. I paid off my credit cards completely for the first time in 20 years, started a retirement fund that's actually growing instead of being constantly depleted by family emergencies, and even bought myself a small cabin in the mountains where I go to write and take photographs. Every month when I review my bank account and see money actually accumulating instead of disappearing, I'm reminded of how much my generosity was being taken advantage of by people who never had any intention of reciprocating or even appreciating the sacrifices I was making for them. The emotional transformation has been even more dramatic than the financial one. I sleep better at night because I'm not lying awake worrying about Michael's problems or rehearsing conversations where I try to convince him to treat me with basic respect. I wake up excited about my own plans and projects, instead of anxiously checking my phone to see if anyone needs anything from me. I make decisions based on what I want and what aligns with my values, rather than calculating how my choices might affect other people's opinions of me. The constant background anxiety that I didn't even realize I was carrying for decades has simply evaporated, replaced by a sense of calm confidence that comes from knowing I can handle whatever life throws at me without needing anyone else's approval or support. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned to distinguish between love and attachment, between caring about someone and being responsible for their happiness. I still love Michael, he's my son, and that bond will never completely disappear, but I'm no longer attached to specific outcomes in our relationship or devastated when he fails to meet my expectations. I've accepted that he may never become the son I hoped he would be, and that's okay because my happiness is no longer dependent on his choices. I care about his well-being in the same way I care about any human being's well-being, but I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my own peace and prosperity to solve problems he's perfectly capable of handling himself. The journey from devastation to liberation wasn't easy, and there were many days when I questioned whether I was being too harsh or whether I should try harder to repair our relationship. But every time I was tempted to go back to the old patterns of behavior, I reminded myself of how empty and exhausted that life had made me feel. I reminded myself that I deserved to be treated with the same kindness and generosity that I had been giving to others for decades. Most importantly, I reminded myself that true love sometimes means loving someone enough to stop enabling their bad behavior, even when setting those boundaries causes temporary pain. The woman who answers to my name today is stronger, wiser, and more genuinely happy than I ever was when I was sacrificing everything for people who took that sacrifice for granted. As I sit here today, exactly 1 year and 3 months after Michael's devastating phone call, I want to share the most important lesson I learned from this entire experience. You have the power to rewrite your story at any point in your life, no matter how old you are or how stuck you might feel. The woman who was crying herself to sleep every night, wondering what she had done wrong to deserve such treatment, transformed into someone who wakes up every morning excited about her own possibilities and adventures. If you've ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or taken for granted by people who should love you, I want you to know that you deserve so much better. And if this story has resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because I want to build a community of people who are committed to treating themselves with the same kindness they show to others. The most powerful realization that came from this journey was understanding that I had been living my entire adult life seeking external validation instead of developing internal worth. Every decision I made was filtered through the question, will this make other people happy with me? Instead of, will this make me happy with myself? I had been so afraid of being seen as selfish that I had become selfless to the point of self-destruction, giving away pieces of my identity until there was almost nothing left that was truly mine. But when you finally start living for your own approval instead of everyone else's, when you start making choices based on your own values instead of other people's expectations, life becomes an adventure instead of a burden. The financial independence that came from stopping the endless cycle of rescue and support was just the beginning. The real freedom came from emotional independence, from no longer needing other people's approval to feel good about myself. I stopped checking social media to see what Michael and Jessica were doing because their lives genuinely stopped affecting my mood or my sense of self-worth. I stopped making excuses for people who treated me poorly and started surrounding myself with individuals who appreciated my company and reciprocated my energy. I stopped saying, I can't afford it, when what I really meant was, I'm saving that money in case someone else needs it more than I do. What surprises people most when I tell this story is that I'm not angry anymore, not at Michael, not at Jessica, not even at myself for allowing the situation to continue for so long. Anger was just a phase I had to move through on my way to something much more powerful, complete indifference to their opinions about my choices. They can think I'm selfish, difficult, or unreasonable. Their thoughts about me are none of my business and have no impact on my daily happiness. The energy I used to spend trying to manage their perceptions of me is now invested in activities and relationships that actually contribute to my well-being and personal growth. The woman telling you this story today is proof that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand better treatment, never too late to build a life that makes you excited to wake up in the morning. Whether you're dealing with ungrateful children, toxic family members, one-sided friendships, or any other relationship that drains more energy than it provides, remember that you always have the option to step back and invest in yourself instead. Your love, your time, your resources, and your energy are precious gifts. Make sure you're giving them to people who treasure them the way you treasure the gifts they give you in return. After hearing my story, I want you to ask yourself some honest questions. What would you have done in my place? When someone you love treats your sacrifices as if they're worthless, at what point do you stop sacrificing and start protecting yourself? Do you believe that unconditional love means accepting unconditional disrespect? Or is it possible to love someone while still maintaining boundaries that preserve your own dignity and well-being? These aren't easy questions, and there aren't simple answers, but they're the kinds of questions that can change your life if you're brave enough to answer them honestly. Here's what I've learned about revenge. The best revenge against people who treat you poorly isn't trying to hurt them back or make them understand how much they hurt you. The best revenge is living so well without them that their absence becomes a gift rather than a loss. The best revenge is becoming so genuinely happy and fulfilled that you stop caring whether they ever recognize their mistakes or apologize for their behavior. The best revenge is building a life so rich with genuine relationships and meaningful activities that you don't have time or energy to waste on people who don't value your presence. Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace? Or does it just create more anger and bitterness that poisons your own happiness? In my experience, the kind of revenge that actually heals involves focusing on your own growth and well-being, instead of trying to control or punish other people. When you stop giving your power away to people who misuse it, when you stop letting other people's choices determine your emotional state, when you start living for your own approval instead of desperately seeking validation from people who will never give it, that's when you win the game, even if no one else realizes you were playing. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories about people who found the courage to choose themselves, even when it meant disappointing others, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Next week, I'll be sharing the story of what happened when Michael finally realized what he had lost, and why my response surprised everyone, including myself. Until then, remember that you deserve to be treated with the same kindness and respect that you show to others, and you have the power to create that reality starting today.